Pixar Soul follows the story of Joe Gardner, a middle school band teacher who is determined to become a jazz musician. Through his untimely death, he goes on a journey that sees him travel through the after and before life in order to learn a very valuable lesson: that life is for living and that he should enjoy every minute. But while the significance of enjoying life is an important moral given by Soul, there is another equally important message that the movie presents to us: the dangers of being too self-centered. On first viewing, I never really saw Joe as a bad or selfish person. All he seems guilty of being is maybe a little bit too in love with jazz. But on subsequent viewings, it became clear to me that Joe is very much a selfish character, almost to the point of not realizing that other people even matter.
But you wouldn't even give me 5 minutes!
I lost everything because of you!
You cheated.
So great is Joe's obsession with jazz that I'd like to present the case that Joe may well have been a lost soul, a concept that the film introduces to us early on and that eventually ends up being the fate of 22. When we break down what a lost soul is and what leads someone to this point, I think you'll agree with me that if anyone fits the criteria, it's Joe Gardner. And beyond just learning to love life, Joe's journey in the movie is of learning to become a selfless character, rather than a fundamentally selfish, lost soul. When Joe forces his way into the before life, he is taken by 22 to a secret place where she frequently hangs out. In this place, Joe encounters human beings who are currently in the zone, a state that people enter when they are so in touch with their passion that they seem to be transported to another place entirely. However, in this same place, we also first encounter lost souls, incoherent monster-like figures who have lost touch with reality.
Some people just can't let go of their own anxieties and obsessions, leaving them lost and disconnected from life, and this is the result.
At first, these concepts seem just like humorous ways to explain certain unexplainable human feelings. But when we learn how someone becomes a lost soul, there is a key piece of insight that struck me. When Morrowind, Joe in 22's spiritual guide, is explaining how lost souls become lost, I found myself surprised by how much the description fit Joe.
So many of them. Sad.
You know, lost souls are not that different from those in the zone.
What?
The zone is enjoyable, but when that joy becomes an obsession, one becomes disconnected from life.
When your passion becomes such an obsession that you lose touch with reality, that is when a soul, otherwise in the zone, becomes a lost soul. The film presents the line between passion and being lost as a thin one. What is healthy and unhealthy amounts of love is hard to tell for people who really enjoy something. Armed with this knowledge, I'd like to now look at Joe's personality and behavior in the film to present the argument that Joe was either already, or at the very least nearly, a lost soul himself, until the end of the movie when his resolution with 22 saves him.
My only purpose on this planet is to play. It's what I was meant to do, and nothing's gonna stop me.
Well, aren't you an arrogant one?
Joe being a lost soul would certainly explain why he's the only one seemingly capable of traveling between the afterlife and before life so easily, because like the hedge fund manager that Morrowind saves, he's been here all along. But whether or not he is definitely one is not as important as understanding why he could have been one. So let's look at how Joe is out of touch with reality. We all know he's obsessed with jazz. Everyone who encounters Joe knows this. And we know from the conflict with his mother that she feels this obsession is unhealthy for him.
How tough being a musician was on your father. I don't want to see you struggle like that.
In fact, in his conversation with his mother, we see that Joe is perhaps a little too possessed by the idea of becoming a jazz musician.
Music is all I think about. From the moment I wake up in the morning to the moment I fall asleep at night.
You can't eat dreams for breakfast, Joey.
Then I don't want to eat.
Joe exclaims that if pursuing the dream of playing jazz meant he couldn't feed himself, he would gladly not eat. Now, it's pretty clear that Joe thinks this is a good thing. He sees it as an expression of his passion and his calling. And on its own, we might also agree with that assessment of his statement. We've all known people who are this passionate and determined. But when we look at the bigger picture, a more sinister pattern emerges. For Joe, jazz and life are actually opposites. They are in conflict with one another. It's either do jazz or enjoy life, not both. To succeed in jazz, he feels he must forego his life. This is, of course, what happens quite literally in the film, when Joe ends up dying and then ends up becoming a successful jazz musician. But 22 shows us, and Joe, that it doesn't have to be this way. For 22, who looks at the world with a fresh perspective, simply enjoying life and taking things as they come is what she calls jazzing.
What you did all right back there. How did you know how to deal with Paul?
I didn't. I just let out the meat. Hey, like you said about jazz, I was jazzing.
For her, jazz and life are the same. But Joe quickly shuts her down, citing that the two operate by very different rules.
First of all, jazzing is not a word. And second, music and life operate by very different rules.
This is very representative of his mentality. The fact that life and jazz are at odds for Joe is just one of the ways in which he is disconnected from reality. Because this conflict between life and jazz also manifests itself in other parts of his personality. And it's why we should look at how Joe is a selfish character. Let's start by looking at Joe, the teacher. Although he's clearly a light-hearted person and an inspirational teacher, we have to question if he's a teacher who actually cares that much about his students.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Gardner.
You're doing my ears a favor.
Hey!
Not you, though. You're good. He's not.
Take the very first scene, for example. Connie, his student, loses herself in the music and begins to play a beautiful, spontaneous riff. But when she is laughed at for this by her peers, how does Joe shut this down?
I remember one time my dad took me to this jazz club, and that's the last place I wanted to be. But then I see this guy.
By regaling his students with his own tale about jazz and his own love and talent for music. Although it wows the students for sure, does it actually help Connie in any way, or even relate to her properly?
That's when I knew I was born to play. Connie knows what I mean. Right, Connie?
I'm 12.
Seemingly not. Later, while Joe is in a cat's body and 22 is in his, notice how Joe responds to Connie coming over to quit.
Good. Now let's go check out that suit.
came to tell you that I quit.
Quit?
Oh, we don't have time for this.
Of course, Joe's urgency and behavior here is understandable. He is, after all, in a cat's body and desperately trying to return to his own with a time limit hanging over his head. But his attitude throughout this scene is that of someone who really doesn't care what Connie is going through.
Like it?
Me too!
What are you doing?
I'd rather hang with Connie.
What? Come back here! You open this.
Whereas 22 is genuinely interested in listening to Connie's perspective and responds organically to what she sees and hears, Joe is seemingly not even slightly concerned that his most talented student is trying to quit. A selfless character, which is what Joe becomes by the end of the movie, would at least take a few minutes to guide 22 into helping Connie so that she doesn't completely give up her love for music. A character who is genuinely invested in Connie's future would engage with her concerns, but Joe just wants her out the way as quickly as possible, even if that means Connie gives up her passion. Joe knows how much jazz means to him, but he's not so bothered that someone else might be giving up their spark or their purpose in life. In fact, he doesn't really even seem to know Connie as well as he thinks he does.
The ruling class's core curriculum stifles dissent. It's the oldest trick in the book.
What are you talking about? She doesn't care about any of
I've been
that.
saying that since the 3rd grade.
Again, none of this is to say that Joe is a bad teacher or even a bad person. He's simply so focused on himself and his own goals that he's lost touch with what it means to be human, to enjoy interactions with other people and build meaningful relationships. He's lost touch with the people and society around him. A lost soul. Clearly, he is still capable of inspiring his students, evidenced by the influence he has on Curly, the man who ultimately helps him get his chance with Dorothea Williams. But notice Joe's response to this voicemail that Curly leaves.
Look, honestly, your class was the only reason I went to school at all. Like, I owe you a lot. So, here's the plan. Clean yourself up, put on a killer suit, and get to the club early. I'm gonna try and talk to her. Just make sure you show up looking like $1,000,000, alright? I hope I see you, man. Alright.
Curly has just expressed to Joe that his class was the only reason he went to school and that he owes him a lot. Combined with the fact that Curly is now a successful musician who is going far out of his way to help Joe, I think any teacher and any person would be inclined to pause for a minute and think about how they've changed Curly's life. How then does Joe respond?
Peace.
Oh, I can get the gig back, 22.
The only thing that Joe takes from this voicemail is simply, I can get the gig back. It seems like he either didn't register or didn't care at all about Curly professing that he's eternally grateful to Joe, or that Joe's teachings had such a profound impact on this young man's life. Joe simply jumps to, how does this affect me and how can I benefit from it? This is pretty standard behavior for a self-centered person. This behavior is even present when Curly first calls him early in the film. Remember that Joe has just been contacted here by one of his former students who is calling to share some great personal news. So how does Joe respond? Well, after a brief congratulations to Curly, he turns the conversation to himself.
I'm the new drummer in the Dorothea Williams Quartet, and we're kicking off our tour with the show at the Half Note tonight.
Dorothea Williams, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Congratulations, man. Wow. I would die a happy man if I could perform with Dorothea Williams.
I would die a happy man if I got to play with Dorothea Williams. Of course, this is part of a plot device to move the story forwards, but it is significant that Joe doesn't care about Curly's success and only sees it in relation to his own fantasies. This is quite typical behavior all of us might recognize. We've all been guilty of this kind of response or known people who are. Someone tells you something and is looking to share and talk, but instead of actually listening to them or understanding their perspective, you start talking about how some similar event happened to you. It doesn't feel self-centered, but it kind of is, because it changes the subject from them to you. Sometimes as a person, it's important to remember that not everything is about yourself. And this is again the lesson that Joe will have to learn by the end of the film. I don't think all of this is a criticism of Joe specifically, by the way. I think this is the writer's commentary on human behavior in general, particularly when you're living in a big crowded city. If we look at the interactions our characters have with the general public of New York, it's largely quite negative.
I said, get out of here, go!
Everyone in New York seems to be angry, selfish, and pretty much operating like no one else exists. In fact, it's almost encouraged to be this way just to survive.
Oh, don't stop. What are you doing? This is New York City. You don't stop in the middle of the streets. Go, go.
Keep your head down and move forwards. This is what the film is commenting on, as much as it is commenting on our need to enjoy every moment of life. Take, for example, the scene in the subway, when 22 spots a busker singing a song for the passers-by. When Joe claims that the only reason 22 loves this song is because she's in his body, we can see quite clearly that this is a lie.
I've never felt like this inside.
Of course, you love music now because you're me. Let's go.
Because despite claiming to love music, Joe himself cannot, or does not, appreciate the beautiful sounds being played right now. Only 22 does. And she can do this because, again, she is connected. She's here in this moment, connected to the people around her. Joe, like many other commuters, are so focused on their own goals that to them, this man barely exists. It is the process of commuting like this itself that the film presents as draining our humanity. So in many ways, Joe's relentless desire to become a jazz musician is born of a desire to escape this very nature of human selfishness. When he's on the subway with 22, Joe explains how the act of riding the subway itself causes human beings to behave badly towards one another.
Don't worry about it. It's the subway. It does that to some people.
Does what?
It wears you down. It stinks. It's hot. It's crowded. Every day the same thing, day in and day out. But once I get on the stage tonight, all my troubles are going to be fixed. You're going to see a brand new Joe Gardner.
It's interesting to note how Joe feels that all his troubles will go away when he becomes a jazz musician, because for him, he's still holding on to the idea that jazz and life are separate entities. For him, somehow being a human and riding the subway means being angry and selfish and self-obsessed. Becoming a jazz star, on the other hand, would save him from all of this. He would be free of such things. He could actually be himself. He could escape riding the subway and escape this flaw of human nature. He could finally start living.
I'm not dying today. Not when my life just started.
And this is why Joe is a lost soul, because he has fundamentally disconnected himself from reality, whether accidentally or deliberately. He's not really living in the world he inhabits. He's only living for himself and his singular goal. I mean, just look at Joe's life. He lives alone, has a strained relationship with his family, and has no discernible friends in the film.
Is there anyone we can call, Mr. Gardner? A next of kin or friend?
Tell her no.
No.
The only person who supports him is Curly, who only recently got back in touch with him. The closest thing that we know Joe has to a friend is Dez, and yet the scene in the barbershop is perhaps the most compelling evidence that Joe is in fact selfish and disconnected from reality. Joe's description of Dez suggests a long familiarity, and the fact that multiple people in the barbershop recognize and know Joe suggests that this is a place he comes often. And yet, as we will see in this scene, he knows nothing about these people. The two key pieces of information that Joe gives 22 about Dez are that he was born to be a barber and that he loves jazz like Joe does. By the end of the scene, we realize that both these things are untrue.
Talk about having a spark. This guy was born to be a barber.
But I can't pass for you in front of all your friends.
Dez is the only one that I talk to. We usually talk about jazz.
In just one afternoon spent with Dez and the people in the barbershop, 22 is able to have a much more meaningful interaction with the people there than Joe ever was. Why? Because 22 is actually listening to what the people around her are saying. She is connected to their feelings and their desires, and feeds back accordingly, the way she was with Connie. Joe is not.
What if you pick up the wrong thing or somebody else's thing? Then you're stuck.
Been there, I guess.
I'll take one of those. I wouldn't call myself stuck, but I never planned on cutting heads for a living.
Wait, but you were born to be a barber, weren't you?
I wanted to be a veterinarian.
Joe's approach to the barbershop is almost transactional. He sees Dez as a natural-born barber who loves jazz because that is what he provides to Joe. He cuts his hair and he listens to Joe ramble on about jazz. In reality, like all human beings, Dez is a complex figure with goals and dreams beyond what you might see on the surface level and interests that would surprise you. This is why 22 gets so much out of the interaction with the barbershop that Joe never did before, because she's really here. She's really present. Joe never was.
It is nice to finally talk to you about something other than jazz, yo.
Huh. How come we, never talked about your life before?
You never asked, but I'm glad you did this time.
Physically, he may have come to the barbershop before, but in any meaningful, emotional, or intellectual way, he was just in his own mind and focused with his own obsession, much like a lost soul. And it is only thanks to 22 that Joe is able to start reconnecting with life and learning to understand the people around him. After the visit to the barbershop, 22 helps Joe reconnect with his mother by actually having a conversation with her that allowed both people to understand each other and their perspectives. When Joe comes out, listen to what he says.
Oh, that was amazing. You know what that felt like? It felt like jazz.
Yeah.
That felt like jazz. For the first time in the film, Joe actually experiences his life with the same emotion that he experiences jazz. Why? Because 22 helped him actually connect with the people around him and see them as more than just the one-dimensional figures Joe has always thought of them. Much the way that Morrowind does earlier and the way that Joe will do later in the film, 22 is helping a lost soul reconnect with what it means to be human. And what it means to be human is to connect with and understand humanity. This ultimate message is one that Joe realizes after he is finally able to succeed in his dream of becoming a jazz musician. After his breakthrough performance with Dorothea Williams, Joe is severely underwhelmed because he realizes that becoming a jazz star didn't magically fix life for him. It didn't change all the things he said it would in the subway. It didn't make him a different person. It's almost as if once the cloud of his obsession finally stops hanging over his head, Joe for the first time is able to see life clearly. Because where does he end up after his performance? Back in the subway. Joe finds himself back where he was before he got his break. All those people he thought he could escape, that selfish human nature that he thought he'd be able to transcend magically by becoming someone else, are all back where he left them. Because the truth is that it wasn't Joe's occupation that was making him behave a certain way. It was his own decisions. This is part of a quick 1-2 punch that will help Joe realize the error of his selfish ways. The second part comes from 22. As a dejected and disappointed Joe returns home, he sits down and empties his pockets. And when he sees the items that 22 collected, that is when he's finally able to come to a grand realization that he's been making a big mistake. What's incredibly significant here is that as he reflects on his life, Joe doesn't start by looking through his own memories. All of the images he sees are initially from when 22 was in his body. Through the perspective 22 saw, he's able to get a completely new look at the things he was previously ignoring. The man singing in the subway, Dez in the barbershop, his mother, Connie. Joe's expression is one of realization. Because on top of realizing that he's been missing out on living his life, Joe realizes that he's been neglecting the people in it too. All these people he was failing to connect with earlier are now suddenly much more real to him, which is why earlier memories suddenly start to come to the fore for him. Of his mother being tender and nurturing, of his father doing the same. He sees Curly again for the first time, and he sees the entire city around him. A city he had fundamentally taken for granted. That is when Joe realizes perhaps the most powerful message of Soul. That really, when you think about it all, we are just tiny parts of a larger world and a larger universe. And to be foolish enough to believe that we are somehow the only important individual in this gigantic story is to miss out on the point of it all. Once he realizes this, Joe instantly reconnects with the zone and rushes to find 22. And as she struggles with her own inner demons, he's able to finally remind her what she taught him, that connecting with the world is what life is really about. This is when Joe makes the ultimate sacrifice. He gives his Earth badge to 22, giving up his own life to give her one, completing his journey from a fundamentally selfish character to a fundamentally selfless one.
But Joe, this means you won't get to...
It's okay. I already did.
Because Joe has realized that being human means being a part of everybody else, and that isn't always such a bad thing.
How are you going to spend your life?
I'm not sure. But I do know. I'm gonna live every minute of it.
Thank you for watching this video. These video essays take a long time and a lot of love and tears to make. So if you enjoyed it, then please do consider sharing it and recommending it to your friends, as well as maybe signing up to my Patreon to support me directly, the link for which is in the video description. If you have any suggestions for future videos, then please do drop them in the comment section below. I'd like to thank my current patrons for their support and you, the viewer, for helping me keep making videos like this. But now, it's time to sign off, so I hope I'll see you soon for the next Soak video, and I hope that, like Joe, you're able to enjoy your life and enjoy it with the people around you. See you soon.